We're going to be in chapter 2, but I wanted to show you this first part here that we have. I told you at the beginning when we did our introduction, Daniel is not laid out in chronological order.
Right.
And you'll see that as you go through. So you have kind of the introduction in chapter 1, and then we have a section of chapter 2 through 7 that's laid out in kind of an interesting way. And it mostly deals with other people's dreams and visions that Daniel interprets. And then chapters 8 through 12, Daniel goes through the visions and the prophecies that God has given him directly. And so things are kind of, things that happen in 8 and 9 are stuff that happened back during when Nebuchadnezzar was king or Belshazzar was king. And so Daniel specifically names 4 different kings over either Babylon, and then later when Babylon was conquered by the Medes and the Persians, we have Darius and Cyrus, and so he kind of bounces all back and forth. But chapters 2 through 7 is kind of laid out interesting. Chapter 2, we have Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and we're going to deal with that tonight. We're going to look at that, and it deals with Gentile kingdoms. And then you have in chapter 3, you have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. I'm trying to get used to saying the real names instead of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But, you know, you grow up in Sunday school all your life saying Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and it's hard to switch over to Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, right? Mm-hmm. But chapter 3 has Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. Now, these first 3 all happened during Nebuchadnezzar, and then Nebuchadnezzar has a vision, the vision of the tree, and Daniel tells him that God's going to punish Babylon. Okay, and then we go to that's chapter 4. Then we get to chapter 5, and he jumps all the way to the end of Belshazzar's reign, and so Belshazzar is not the king immediately after Nebuchadnezzar, it's another king, and then you have Belshazzar, and he jumps to the very end of his reign, in fact the very last day of Belshazzar's life, and we have Belshazzar's vision. So we have a dream, and then we have a dream about Gentile kingdoms, and then we have God's protection of Israelites with the fiery furnace. And then we have the vision of Nebuchadnezzar with God's punishment on Babylon. And then the order reverses itself. In chapter, that's 2, 3, and 4. Chapter 5, we have Belshazzar's vision, the handwriting on the wall. That's an expression we still use today, right? I can see the writing on the wall. And that was the many, many tekel upharsin, that God was going to take his kingdom away and give it to the Medes and the Persians. And so that is chapter 5, which is very at the end. Then chapter 6, he jumps all the way into the new kingdom with King Darius, which was the king that actually at the end of things begins to send Nehemiah and Ezra and them back. But that is where we find the famous story of Daniel in the lion's den, right? And that's chapter 7 deals with that. So that's God's protection of Israel. It kind of mirrors Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that happened in chapter 3. And then chapter 7 jumps back to the very first year of Belshazzar's reign. And the neat thing about Daniel is even though he jumps around all over the place, he tells you where he is. At the beginning of his chapters, he'll tell you this is the first year of Belshazzar's reign, and the 3rd year of Darius's reign. And so you can see where he's jumping around. And we know from other books of the Bible, and also from the history of Babylon and the history of the Persian Empire, we know basically when those kings were, so we can kind of get that. But to me, it was just interesting the way that's laid out. If you look, it goes in a certain order.
Right.
And that's and also something different about these chapters 2 through 7. They were written in a different language than the whole rest of the book.
Oh, good.
Okay? They were written in Aramaic, which is actually, we think, the language that Jesus grew up speaking. And it's kind of it was not the Hebrew language, it was similar in that it used the same alphabet as the Hebrew language, but it was a different language. Just like Spanish and English use the same alphabet, but they're totally different languages. Yeah. But most languages back then had their own set of alphabet. But Aramaic, this was written, and probably very few people in Babylon would have been able to read this language. Only people that grew up in certain, not even every Hebrew would be able to read this language. Now, it became more in common practice by the time of Jesus. Aramaic was kind of the common tongue that was spoken around among the Jews, and especially when they didn't want anybody else understanding them. And so when my daughters, most of them, this one is the exception. She understands it, but she won't speak it. But most of my daughters speak Spanish, and so when we would be places and I'd want to get on to them without everybody knowing what we were saying, I'd say something to them in Spanish, and so then they knew I was being serious with them, and they knew I wasn't trying to embarrass them in front of everybody else, but this was something that was between me and my daughter that wasn't really for everybody else, and so I'd say it in Spanish. And that's kind of, Aramaic was kind of that kind of language. That it was a very obscure language, not very many people spoke it, but chapters 2 through 7 of Daniel are written in Aramaic, which is kind of interesting. Then you get to chapter 8 and he's back and it's in Hebrew. He's writing in Hebrew. So chapter 1 and then chapters 8 through 12 are in Hebrew, chapters 2 through 7 are in Aramaic. And the subject matter there is kind of, and this form that he's got it in is kind of, it's kind of a common poetic thing. It's ancient poetry, ancient literature, where they call it, there's a word for it, I don't know if I can pronounce it, chiasma or something like that, I don't know. The biblical scholars have a word for it, and so.
Is it because he was taken captive that he changed?
Yeah, I think so. I think he was.
I
think he was recording this, and maybe he didn't want people to know that he was telling them the secrets of the king's dreams and things like that. Possibly. Now we got that later. It's interesting. Man, Daniel's got some really interesting stuff. We'll get to it later, but there's one chapter that starts off where he says that he is reading the book of Jeremiah the prophet. And he reads about the 70 years. Now this is towards the end of Daniel, but just this book is so neat because Jeremiah was the prophet in Israel when Daniel was carried off captive. And the book that Daniel wrote hadn't been written yet when Daniel was carried off captive. Now it's not just the book of Jeremiah, what we have. In the book of Jeremiah, or in the prophecy of Jeremiah that we have in our Bible, there's one spot about 3/4 of the way through Jeremiah where God tells Jeremiah, I want you to write this prophecy down in a book, and I want you to take this book and give it to the king for them to have and to open when they need it. And that book was carried off with later captives. And what that book dealt with was, look, you're going to be captive, and you're going to be in captivity for 70 years. That's what that book that Jeremiah wrote was. And so then in Daniel, later on, Daniel somehow gets his hands on this book, or a copy of the book that Jeremiah had written, talking about they're going to be in captivity 70 years. Well, Daniel knows how long he's been in captivity, and so Daniel takes Jeremiah's prophecy and kind of adds on to it. But when you're looking at that and you're thinking, well, how did Daniel read Jeremiah's book when Daniel was in Babylon when Jeremiah wrote it, and Jeremiah was in Jerusalem when he wrote it? Jeremiah never goes to Babylon. In fact, right before the fall of Jerusalem, Jeremiah is carried off by some high-ranking members there, and they go to Egypt. So Jeremiah ends his life in Egypt, never goes to Babylon, but his book does. The book that he wrote was carried off with the captives. That last king that was carried off captive, they carried that book with them into Babylon, and that book ends up in Daniel's hand. So it's just kind of some of the neat stuff. And we're going to see tonight one of the interesting things in Daniel. And here I just kind of have an outline of this chapter. Okay? And we'll go down through this outline, and then we'll look at some neat stuff in this chapter. But what's cool about Daniel's prophecies, we talked about this, is they're very specific. In other words, a lot of times they'll give you the prophecy, and but Daniel will give you the prophecy, and then he'll tell you what it means. He'll go through and talk about what the prophecy means. And so this starts off, if we want to turn to Daniel chapter 2. We're not going to read the whole chapter right now, but we see here it says, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, if we think about this, where was Daniel in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar? You remember last week we were talking about how they were carried off captive. They were in the house of the eunuchs. And then the king, Nebuchadnezzar, asked this is all in chapter 1, he asked him, he said, separate me out some of these guys, right? And they're going to eat the king's meat, and they're going to learn the language, and they're going to learn all the arts and sciences of all the stuff that's going on. And they were taken out of the house of the eunuchs and placed with the wise men of Babylon, okay? The astrologers and the mages and all these things that we're about to see in chapter 2, they were placed with them so they could learn the arts and the sciences and the language of the Chaldeans, all these things that they were supposed to be taught. But we learned in chapter 1 that they were going to be in that training for 3 years. So the second year of Nebuchadnezzar, so that means they hadn't been very long in this training when this chapter 2 happens. Right. So when chapter 2 happens, they are still like I said, like Daniel is not chronological. He told us about this 3 years in chapter 1, and now he's jumping into like the first year or the second year of that training. That they're in there. They're in this house. These 4 young men are together in a house. We're going to see that they're sharing a room at this place. And the king has a dream, and I think Nebuchadnezzar, at least in this, was a lot like me. I wake up in the morning, and I remember I had a dream, and I remember it was a really cool dream, and that's about all I remember. And I'll think I've got part of it, and by the time I get out of bed, it's just gone. But I'm just left with this impression that I had a really neat dream. Man, that dream was so vivid, and while I'm dreaming it, I think, boy, I hope I can remember this one, And then it's just gone. But Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. It says there, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams wherewith his spirit was troubled and his sleep brake from him. And so it says that he commanded to call the magicians and the astrologers and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans for to show the king his dreams. So he calls them to come, and he's like, I'm having these weird dreams. I need somebody to tell me what's going on. They're waking me up at night. I'm troubled by it. And so they tell him in verse 4, they say, O king, live forever. Tell thy servants the dream, and we will show you the interpretation. And in verse 5, it says, the king answered and said unto the Chaldeans, the thing is gone from me. I don't know what it was I dreamed. I don't know what my dream was. That's why I'm calling you. I need you to tell me what my dream was. And so if you think, I kind of had the impression in my head that he just wanted to see if they knew what the dream was, but I think he really didn't know what the dream was. This wasn't like a test for them. Okay, I dreamed this dream, and if you can tell me what it was I dreamed, then you'll win the prize. He was troubled by this dream, and he couldn't remember even what the dream was, and so how are you going to interpret something you don't know what it is? And he's perplexed, and he calls all of the wise men together, and they come and they say, look, we'll interpret the dream, right? We'll go get one of those books on Amazon about interpreting dreams, and we can interpret the dream. Just tell us what the dream was. But he says, it's gone. I can't do that. I'm sorry. It says, this thing is gone from me. And then he gives them a threat. He gives them a little incentive. He gives them a little incentive here, and he says, if you won't make known unto me the dream with the interpretation thereof, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made a dunghill. That's a little, graphic there, but that's kind of some incentive. Now the deal was, this was their job. These were his wise men. These were the magicians and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans they were part of. We hear about the Chaldeans a lot, but they were kind of an old part of Babylon. They were the original Babylonians, and they were the wise men, the keeper of all the knowledge of Babylon and all of that. And they called these men together. These were the ones that should have showed him. And they kept saying, he says, but if you do it, then you'll have great honor and gifts and all these things. But if you can't, here's what's going to happen. Because I really want this done. Well, it's good to be the king, right? It's good to be the king. Look, I can reward you, but there's a stick and a carrot, right? There's a stick and a carrot. So he goes through this, and they keep saying that tell us the dream, tell us the dream. And he says, look, I know you're just biding your time. You're waiting, you want me to have the dream again to see if I can remember it. He says that down in verse 8. He said, I know of a certainty that you would gain the time because you see the thing is gone for me. He says, you know I don't remember the dream. And so maybe they're hoping that he'll dream it again and remember a little bit of it or something, because they're getting nervous. But we go down here, and they couldn't do it. Verse 12, the king was angry and very furious, and he commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. Now, included in that, all the wise men of Babylon, was the wise men and their students. Okay, this is where the point we're in. So this instance is not just Daniel saving everybody else. Daniel is caught up in this, and we see that the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and looks at, and they sought Daniel and his fellows. That's Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to be slain. And so the guy comes to their house and knocks on the door, and they don't even know what's going on. They're kids. They weren't called in before the king. It was their masters that were called in before the king, their teachers. Now all of a sudden somebody shows up at the door and says, well, I'm sorry, but I'm glad y'all are doing well, but I've got some bad news. Your teacher wasn't able to do this, so I'm here. And the guy that came to him, his name was Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, and he was the one that was, it says, gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. And so Daniel's like, what's going on? And Arioch tells Daniel what was going on. And so now the wheels start moving in Daniel's head. I need some time here. Wait a minute. Give me a minute now. Let me think about this, what I can do.
Yep.
And so he asks Arioch to go to the king and tell him, look, we think we got somebody, one of them, that can do it, but can you come tomorrow? Can you put this off a day? And it says in 16, Daniel went in and desired of the king that he would give him time, that he would show the king the interpretation. Now, this is really important here. We see here in verse 17, it says that Daniel goes back, verses 17 and 18, that Daniel goes back to his house and made the thing known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions. That's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Mm-hmm. And he goes back and says, guys, we got to come up with something. Mm-hmm. What are we going to do? And so Daniel, it says that he went to them that they would desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. So Daniel comes back and he says, boys, it's time to pray. Okay? He said, and Daniel wasn't here seeking out glory. It wasn't that Daniel wanted to be the one for it to be revealed to. He goes back and he said, look, I got us a little time, but the only thing that's going to save us is God.
Amen.
The only thing that's going to save us is God. Have you ever been at a point like that in your life? Where God, if you don't do something, I don't know what's going to happen.
Yep. Amen.
You get to that point, and it's like, and so what Daniel does, he goes to his friends. He goes to the people that he trusts, the people that he knows love him, the people that he prays with every day. And he goes to them and he asks them to ask God for mercy. It's interesting here. They don't go demanding that God give them the answer to anything. They go and they ask God for mercy and forgiveness for them. And when we go to God in prayer, we get at those moments. So, a lot of times we're crying out, Lord, save me. You've got to do something. But the attitude that Daniel had in this prayer was, we're going to go to God and just ask God to be merciful to us. Because we don't deserve this. Daniel wasn't saying, look, we deserve because, you know what, we're not eating the king's meat, and we're not drinking the king's wine, and we're not polluting ourselves with the customs of the king. We're doing what's right. Daniel didn't lay out, when God knows our hearts.
Yes.
We don't have to convince God of how good we are. And he knows us. Right? He knows the deep down of us. And he knows that even when a lot of times even when we're doing the right thing, we may be doing it for the wrong reasons.
Oh, yeah.
And so when we go to God, it's not, I've been, believe me, I've been in situations where it's like, Lord, why would this happen to me?
Yeah.
Just today, today was a good day and an awful day, but it was one of those days. My wife, we were able to get my wife into the doctor today.
Very good.
Wonderful thing. And, it just went well. Everything's going good. Everything's going great. We get in my truck, get up on the highway. We start back, and my RPM gauge on my truck starts going, and my transmission won't shift. And
Happened to me yesterday.
huh?
That happened to me yesterday on one of my trucks.
And I'm sitting there and I could nurse it along in about 35, 40 miles an hour, but it go to shift up into third gear, and then just boom, the tachometer just go flying up, and the engine go racing. And I got back off the highway, nursed it to my dad's house. My dad gave us a ride home, so I'm in the little, and I'm thinking, I'm trying to look, I'm doing something good. I know I'm doing what you want me to do, and I'm heading back so I can preach, and my truck breaks down. You think, why is this happening to me? But you don't need, other times in my life, Lord, I'm trying to do what's right, or it seems like I'm trying to do what's good, and now all of a sudden all this falls on. Why? I mean, here were these three guys that had stood up when nobody else would. They had purposed in their hearts not to defile themselves with the thing of the king. They had stood up to the king. They'd stood up to the captain of the eunuchs. They'd stood up to the prince that he had put there and said, we are not going to defile ourselves of the king's meat. They did all of this. They were being blessed. They moved out of the house of eunuchs. They're there. They're studying hard. They're progressing. And now all of a sudden, here's this captain of the king's guard knocking on the door saying, pardon me, but I have to kill you now. Right? Because of something somebody else is not able to do. And so Daniel goes to his friends and he says, guys, we need to pray. Sometimes we need other people to pray with us.
Yes.
Right.
It's one of the strengths of being in a church and having a church family, brothers and sisters in Christ. And, sometimes when I can go to Brother Mike, I can go to Brother Tom, and I can say, you know what, I just need you I need your prayers today.
Yeah.
I just need you to go before the face of God for me today. And sometimes, you know, people call me and I get messages on my phone, brother, can you pray for this? Can you pray? And we need to take those things seriously.
Yes, absolutely.
What we see here, verse 19, it says, the secret was revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. That's verse 19. And verses 20 through 23, I got on your notes there, I just noted it's Daniel asked Hananiah, that should be 17 and 18. God reveals the dream to Daniel, should be verse 19. Make that correction. Verses 20 through 23, Daniel is praising and thanking God for giving him the answer in those verses. Verses 24 and 25, Daniel goes and he comes back to the king. Now it's interesting in verse 26, the king asks this question. You see this in verse 26 in the text. The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, art thou able? Are you able? Can you do this? Can you make known unto me the dream which I have seen and the interpretation thereof? Art thou able? Are you able to do this? Now Daniel could have said, I got this.
Could have.
Right? I got this. Yeah, man, I can do this. I got this. But that's not what Daniel did. In fact, Daniel spends 2 verses telling him, I can't do this. This is not in my power, and it's not in the power of any of your wise men. It's not in the power of anybody that's down here. He says this, you see it in verses 27 and 28. Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king hath demanded cannot the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers show unto the king. He says what? But there is a God in heaven. Not a God over there in your temple. Not a God out there in the woods. But there's a God in heaven.
Yes.
That reveals secrets and makes known to the king what shall be in the latter days. So Daniel here, Daniel already knows he knows the dream and he knows the interpretation. He knows more than the king does. And he's already giving here the king an idea of what this dream means, because he says God's going to reveal to you what's going to happen in the latter days. The things that are to come. And so then Daniel tells him what the dream is. We're going to look at that in a minute. We're going to look at the dream and that prophecy. I've got a page there that talks about that, which gets into some prophecy. Daniel tells him what the dream is, verses 29 to 35. He tells him the interpretation of the dream. Then the king worships Daniel and reveres Daniel's God. He does both things before Daniel. Then he promotes Daniel, and it's interesting to me here in chapter 2, at the end of chapter 2, verse 48, the king made Daniel a great man and gave him many gifts and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. But look what Daniel does. Then Daniel requested of the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. Okay, now in verse 48, he given Daniel that position. Now, Daniel says, I don't want this position. That's not the position I want. Later on under King Darius, Daniel gets an even higher position. But right now, Daniel says, these 3 guys. And why do you think Daniel lifted up those 3 instead of himself? Daniel was the one, look, in the world's eyes, Daniel was the one who God revealed the dream to. Daniel was the one who went and stood before the king. But it was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. It was those 3 that while God was revealing that were on their knees praying for David. They prayed, they went And they went to their knees for Daniel in that moment. These were the ones, and we don't know everything that had happened. We know that these three were lifelong companions and friends. These four men, at this time, four young boys, maybe teenagers at this point, and they are the ones that had stood up together. When Daniel got weak, it was these three that lifted him up. And God used Daniel, but Daniel knew that he couldn't do it without these other three guys. None of us can do it alone. And so the community that we have together as we worship together, and the bonds we form, and the friendships we have, and the prayers we have for each other, and the way we lift each other up before God is so important. Because none of us, I cannot do this without you. Right? I mean, it's just, I can't, there's no way that I can even begin to stand up there. I mean, I think every time I get up here, I think, well, who am I to stand up there and try to teach God's word? You know, and, you know, some of you maybe have been saved longer than I have. And sometimes I'm preaching to people that have been, you know, they've been going to church for 60 years. They were teaching these very stories that I'm teaching before I was born. You know, and I realized that, you know what, the people now that are here with me praying, the people that throughout my life have prayed for me and lifted me up and taught me and all of these things, I've got friends that I grew up in youth group. I was fortunate enough to be in an extraordinary youth group, and about half of our youth group now are pastors. Of these young men that I grew up with, and the ones that aren't pastors, I only know of one that's not in church somewhere today. All of them are serving the church, the music directors, the deacons, the pastors. But you know what? We prayed for each other. We worshiped together. We weren't just going to events together in the youth department, but we really lifted each other up. There was a year where we didn't even have a youth director, and we did it ourselves. And we took turns teaching the class. And then the pastor pretty soon had us when we were in high school. We were over the young kids department. And we were doing the teaching and the training in there, and we lifted each other up. But all of that, none of it was I ever able to do by myself. And Daniel is sitting there, look, these guys deserved it as much as I did. It was as much their prayer that brought this revelation from God as it was mine. I may be the one that's delivering. I may be the one standing, you know, I may be the one standing in the pulpit preaching when somebody gets saved at church. But you know what? That person who got saved from church was invited by someone else here in his body. They were